I'd like to thank Zehra and Boon Hui for the invitation to present my research here today, and Kelly for making excellent arrangements for my travel and stay. It's been a pleasure to see the works in the exhibition after having spent so much time considering the history of modernism in India. I'm looking forward to the other papers and to our discussion today. Can we get the lights a little bit dimmer, or is this kind of how we're going to be? All right. Firebrands, who forged a new art for a new India, was Jason Farago's summary of the Progressive Revolution in a review of the exhibition for the New York Times. Farago correctly understands the revolution in the exhibition's title to be historiographical as well as aesthetic. For this critic, the progressive artist's revolutionary force applies as much to the United States and Western art history as it does to India and Asian art history. Farago writes, quote, "When I was a student of art history, the textbooks offered a simple, tidy, and wrong story of painting after 1945. The first years after World War II were taught as a clean baton pass from Picasso to Pollock. The New York school led the way, Europe got a brief and sometimes sneering look, and begrudging attention was paid to the avant-gardes of just a few rich, non-Western nations, the concretists of Brazil, the Gutai artists of Japan. Slowly, too slowly, museums are now taking up the task of rewriting the history of art since 1945 as more than just a triumph of American painting, as the veteran critic Irving Sandler called it." End quote. Indeed, the art historical turn toward less Eurocentric and more nuanced and complex accounts of modernism and modernity has been well underway in academic writing and museum practice for over a decade now. It has yielded books, such as those reviewed in the Art Bulletin in 2016 under the rubric Cosmopolitan Art Worlds, including Worldly Affiliations, My Study of Modernism in India from the 1930s through the 1980s, Chika Okeke Agulu's Post-Colonial Modernism, a study of modern art in Nigeria, focusing on the 1950s and 1960s, and Pedro Erber's Breaching the Frame, a study of mid-20th century art and poetry in Brazil and Japan. It has also resulted in major exhibitions on non-Western artists and movements such as Gutai, Splendid Playground at the Guggenheim in 2013, and the Nasreen Mohammadi retrospective at the Met Breuer and Reina Sofia in 2016. There are many more exhibitions that I could cite, but these two stand out for striking visual presentations, well-researched catalogs, and new historiographical insights. I count the Progressive Revolution among this wave of new studies of global modernisms and transnational cultural exchange that have revised Sandler's accounts of the triumph of American art and the art critic Clement Greenberg's notions of purity and opticality as the hallmark of modernist art. Scholars working on artists and artworks from Mexico, Brazil, Senegal, Nigeria, Vietnam, China, Japan, Iran, Turkey, Syria, Pakistan, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union have cast new light on modernism's varied forms and multiple lives. For my presentation today, I'd like to move away from the questions of originality and derivation, center and periphery, citation and critique that have animated this scholarship, mine included, and that will surely come up in our discussions. What I focus on instead is the effects of the progressive artist group in modern India, effects that perhaps run contrary to the claims of the exhibition and the group's self-image as iconoclasts. These effects were profound and exceeded the official membership of the group, the members' individual and collective activities, and their geographic location in Bombay. The achievement of the progressive artists is best characterized as a series of ripples and reverberations rather than as a revolution, effects that were crucial to the development of modernism in India. The groundwork for their practice was laid in various parts of India and in diverse areas of cultural practice during the 1930s and 1940s. In Bengal, by the art of Ramkinkar Bej and Rabindranath Tagore, whose work some of you will have seen in a beautiful show here at the Asia Society, The Last Harvest, curated by R. Shivkumar in 2011. In Shimla, by Amrita Shergill, whose work was shown in Documenta last year and will be shown in an exhibition, Museum Global, that opens in Dusseldorf next month. In Almora, by the dance dramas of Uday Shankar and his troupe, including Zora Sehgal, who would go on to join the Indian People's Theatre Association, commonly known as IPTA. In Lucknow, by Mulk Raj Anand and Sajjad Zahir, members of the All India Progressive Writers Association, which would cross-pollinate IPTA and Bombay cinema, represented by the image of the actor and director Prithviraj Kapoor playing Sikandar, or Alexander the Great, on the right. The Progressive Artists Group, the Progressive Writers Association, and IPTA had distinct agendas, but they were united in their opposition to colonialism, fascism, capitalism, and cultural conservatism. They were closely involved in anti-colonial nationalist politics and with the Communist Party of India. In worldly affiliations, which you see on sale in the shop here, I argue that we must revise our narratives of modernism in the visual arts in India and begin to relate their aesthetic projects and commitments to internationalism and socialism. To think the progressives, artists, writers, and theater practitioners together would illuminate distinct pathways of modernism and modernity in India. I'm pleased to note that our gathering today moves in this direction, as some of the afternoon sessions will consider the term progressive in different media and forms. One of the major differences, so let's return now to the visual arts. One of the major differences between the progressive artists and the other groups I've mentioned is longevity. As Karin Zitzewitz has noted, the Progressive Artists Group disbanded almost as soon as it formed, with the departures of Raza and Francis Newton Souza for Paris and London in 1949 and 1950, respectively. The short-lived group held 2 shows in Baroda and Bombay in 1947. Some scholars date its demise to that year, and others to 1953, the date of their 3rd and last exhibition in Bombay. The artists in the group went on to have largely independent, varyingly successful careers in India and the world. Yet they occupy a powerful place in Indian art history and the cultural imagination, not least because of Hindu nationalist attacks on M.F. Husain since the 1990s that forced him into exile. The Progressive Artists Group notion of art as action, as translation, and as expression have been highly influential in modern India. Yet these notions of art have been called into question by the rise of the Hindu right, and indeed by the secular practice of contemporary artists whose work I'm writing on now. First, let us consider the idea of art as action. Souza remembers the beginnings of the Progressive Artists Group thus, quote, "I had begun to notice that the JJ School of Art turned out an awful number of bad artists year after year, and the Bombay Art Society showed awful crap in its annual exhibitions, which comprised the amateur efforts of some mem sahabs in India who were pampered by British colonialism. Hence, their pretty pictures, together with the work of several artists coming out of the art school exhibited once a year in the Art Society, had no directions, no goal, no inspiration, no energy, regardless of the style or method they choose to work in. It then occurred to me to form a group, to give ourselves an incentive. Ganging up in a collective ego is stronger than a single ego," end quote. Souza's memory of individual and collective intention encapsulates the myth of a group of young Turks and bad boys who set out, indeed ganged up, to challenge bourgeois, colonialist, nationalist norms and values. He presents the artist as a heroic, pioneering, and rebellious individual who nonetheless belongs to and participates in a group to effect artistic and social change. The notion of a loose and shifting artistic association sustained the progressive writers and IPTA and other groups that emerged in post-colonial India, such as Group 1890, active in the 1960s, whose image you see on the left, and the group of artists who showed together in the exhibition Place for People of 1981, and this group was active in the 1970s, and you see their image on the right. These artists were painters, sculptors, and printmakers who viewed art making as political, as a means of critique. Or, to quote an unpublished letter from Mulk Raj Anand to Souza, as creative action. Anand founded and edited the art journal Marg, which promoted the work of the progressive artists in the 1940s and afterward. Rebellions against the establishment and mobilization as a group was visible on the pages of art journals Contra and Vrishchik, where artists and critics banded together to challenge the ideologies and institutions of the art world, including the Progressive Artists Group and the Lalit Kala Akademi, India's National Academy of Art. These rebellions notwithstanding, the journals testified to a second effect of the progressive artists, the notion of art as translation. In an essay published in Vrishchik in 1972, View of a Volcano, with various members of the artistic profession warming their arses on it, the poet Adil Jasavala asserted common ground between painting and poetry. Quote, "While I do not expect the visual and plastic arts to do the work of literature and vice versa, in terms of the responsibility towards the society they work for, I do not expect artists to play one kind of role and writers a substantially different one. And whatever standards I might use to criticize the former in terms of their failure to understand this responsibility or in terms of the wide gap between their professed and actual commitments, they are the same as I would apply to myself and fellow writers." End quote. Jasavala's urgent tone, angry prose, and fierce style recall Sousa's remarkable autobiographical essay, Nirvana of a Maggot, published in 1955 in the British literary journal Encounter, in which the progressive artist describes the post-colonial condition. Quote, "How can one articulate an Anglo-Saxon with a jeweled mandible that was fashioned by the ancient Konkan goldsmiths of Goa?" End quote. The artist struggles to find language. Quote, "My inarticulation was due to England having possessed a lot of boats, which had netted India into its vast empire." End quote. Referring to Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, the artist describes himself as a blooming maggot on a dung heap with the nose of a fetus. This painting by Sousa, contemporary with the essay, bristles with anger and alienation, conveys splitting and doubling, and locates the post-colonial artist between tycoon and tramp, anticipating Jasavala's critique of that artist as a bourgeois individual 15 years later. Contrary to Greenberg's theories of medium specificity and avant-garde originality, modernist artists in India understood their practice as translation between media, languages, and spaces. They rejected the canons, schools, textbooks, and institutions of British colonialism and Indian nationalism that divided cultural practice into discrete and opposing categories: art and crafts, folk and classical, Eastern and Western. They viewed translation between cultural practices as a badge of identity, hence Sousa's commitment to writing and Jasavala's to painting. In the 1960s and 1970s, M.F. Husain, Akbar Padamsee, and Tayyab Mehta made films commissioned by the Films Division of India, a government agency. Nasreen Mohammadi and Nalini Malani experimented with photography and film at a time when these were not considered proper media for art in India. Throughout their careers, Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh and K.G. Subramanian produced critical writing as well as visual art. Sheikh is also a poet. The art critic Richard Bartholomew was a painter, poet, photographer, and curator. The artist J. Swaminathan was a critic, editor, and museum director. Translation, as ethical stance and committed deprofessionalization, what I have elsewhere called loafing, was a way of life for artists in India in 20th century India. Let me now turn to the third effect of the progressive artists, the notion of art as expression. In a 1965 interview with Bombay collector Ayaz Pirboy, Husain claimed, quote, "When I paint, I experience an expression of my being. The painting represents in a way the totality of my experience," end quote. This idea of art as individual expression was inextricably linked to ideas about freedom, secularity, and national identity in modern India. In 1954, Akbar Padamsee was charged for obscenity under Section 292 of the Indian Penal Code, one of the statutes that Husain was charged with violating some 50-odd years later. In the 1940s, the progressive writers, Ismat Chughtai and Sadat Hasan Manto, were charged under the same section of the Indian Penal Code for their groundbreaking fictions, Manto famously 5 times. Padamsee's paintings, Lovers I and Lovers II of 1952, which depict a heterosexual couple with the male figure pinching his female partner's breast, on display at the Jahangir Art Gallery in Bombay, attracted the attraction and censor of authorities. The artist, this is in 1954, the artist was arrested, tried, and eventually acquitted by the Bombay High Court. Padamsee proposed that Husain testify as a witness for the defense, but this did not come to pass. The notion of art as expression, exemplified by this episode, was influential in modern India and remained a cherished ideal for artists, even those who represented a model of art that departed from that of the progressives. In the 1960s, oh, I'm sorry, I thought I had advanced to Lovers. All right, this is upstairs in the galleries, which is really wonderful to see. So, pointer is a little sticky today. All right, so this notion of art as expression was influential and remained a cherished ideal for artists, even those who represented a model of art that departed from this. In the 1960s, the artist Bhupen Kakkar drew on found images from the bazaar or market and inscribed them with legible and illegible writing in exuberant collagist paintings such as Pawn Shop, which you see here. Responding to Kakkar's first solo exhibition at the Jahangir Art Gallery in Bombay in 1965, the critic, Charles Fabry, who you see here, asked, "Is this madness?" The artist Ram Kumar, who you see here, dismissed Kakkar's work as caricature. Fabry and Ram Kumar disapproved of the subjects and style of Kakkar's work, which did not meet their standards of good taste in modernist art. Yet Kakkar's paintings and his performative openings, catalogues, poems, and plays continued a tradition of secular sacrilege established by Sousa. In 1965, Vivan Sundaram hung one of Kakkar's collages in the canteen of the Maharaja Sayaji Rao University in Baroda, where it was subsequently found torn to shreds, presumably by canteen workers who were offended by its combination of sacred and profane imagery. In 2007, that scene, that is to say, hanging one's artwork at the Maharaja Sayaji Rao University in Baroda, played out rather differently for the young artist S. Chandramohan, whose work was removed from a student exhibition at the university, and the artist was arrested for his blasphemous pictures of Jesus Christ and the goddess Durga. In 2018, the artist Shakuntala Kulkarni writes, "We are constantly bombarded with notions of being national, anti-national. Some accept the ban on freedom of expression, many of us don't, but are fearful of opposing it. And some are courageous risk takers willing to endanger their lives for their beliefs," end quote. The assassination of epigraphist M.M. Kalburgi in Dharwar in 2015 and of editor Gauri Lankesh in Bangalore in 2017 at the hands of Hindu right-wing activists attest to the very real dangers of such risk-taking. Award Vapsis, or returnees, such as Uday Prakash, Nayantara Sehgal, and Ashok Vajpayee, and many, many others now, who have returned prestigious literary and artistic awards bestowed by the Indian state since 2015, attest to how artists have been unwilling to accept an implicit ban on the freedom of expression. While such acts cannot be directly traced to the progressive artist group, they bear witness to the persistent effects of modernism, of art as action, translation, and expression in a social and political world that is far removed from Nehruvian India. Like the progressives, the Vapsis are artists who understand themselves first and foremost as citizens. A recent call for submissions by the Delhi-based photography journal Pics featured Akshay Mahajan's photograph of a young boy standing in front of a statue of India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, on the campus of a research university named after him in New Delhi. The man and the university have come under siege since 2016 and been declared anti-national, communist, and seditious. Mahajan's citizen, this young boy, came to mind as I viewed murals and graffiti playing on the words of Mao Zedong, here, and the images of Pablo Picasso, here, at the School of Arts and Aesthetics on the Jawaharlal Nehru University campus this summer. These students' works and the Vapsi's returns perform dissent, protest, and critique that make me reluctant to declare secularism, modernism, or progressivism dead or destroyed in contemporary India. Viewing these acts of courage and conscience by his fellow citizens, I dare say Sousa would have been, quote, happy as a librarian, which is how he described his primitive, post-colonial, progressive, artistic self over 60 years ago. Thank you.
I'd like to express my thanks to Zehra and to Boon Hui, and as well to Kelly for putting all of this together. And I'd like to thank Sonal for that fantastic paper, which will really help situate what I'm going to say, which will be a bit more of a drill down into a couple of concepts that have been introduced. So, and my last note of thanks is I'm happy to be back in New York talking about secularism and about the Progressive Artist Group because I did the research that I'll present way back when I was a graduate student at Columbia. So it's kind of a nice return for me. The product of that research was a book called The Art of Secularism, The Cultural Politics. Actually, Sonal, do you have the clicker? I'm missing something important. All right, no, it's all good. All right. So, the product of that research was a book called The Art of Secularism, The Cultural Politics of Modernist Art in Contemporary India. It's not really about the Progressive Artist Group, but it took its cue, oh boy, okay, oops. It took its cue from the insistent and recurring attacks by Hindu nationalist activists that Sonal mentioned on one of the group's original members, M.F. Husain. Those attacks, which began in 1996 and lasted until his death in 2011, raised the question of why the association between visual art and political secularism was so durable. The inhabitants of India's art world, including both artists and what in India are called in art lovers, I love that, tend to evince a secular disposition and hold secularist political commitments. As in many other places around the world, Indian art institutions claim space in a secular public domain, and Indian artists exercise their rights to expression as citizens of a secular state. But the relationship of art to the formation of the secular goes much further than these institutional grounds. This is true when we consider artistic subjectivity, or the manner in which art practice is tied to a set of ideas about the self, identity, and expression of the artist. In India, artistic subjectivity was aligned with a secular nationalist mode of citizenship, but it was never fully described by it. The practices of self-fashioning that allow Indian artists to recognize themselves as artists, and particularly as modern artists, are drawn from national, regional, and local subjective practices, as well as from globally circulating models of artistic subjectivity. Those more global discourses of artistic subjectivity have allowed Indian modern artists to occupy a unique insider-outsider position in the Indian public sphere. Similarly, the works of art these artists produce constitute an archive of iconic images of secular national culture that far exceeds state iconography in its richness and complexity. Artists have proven quite sensitive to changes in the definition of the secular, and a close look at the art historical record both demonstrates the quick reaction speed of Indian artists, and perhaps more importantly, the mutable nature of what seems to be an enduring concept of secularism. In my comments today, I will explicate art as a site of secular discourse from two directions. First, I'll differentiate what Talal Asad calls formations of the secular to explore secularism's various forms of relationship to art. Then I'll look at how that relationship worked out in practice as M.F. Husain developed his approach to art in the 1950s. And here you have to listen to me instead of looking, if I can advance the thing. Okay, sorry, blank. All right. It won't be long. The crucial move in Talal Asad's innovative anthropology of secularism is to propose an analytical distinction between the political doctrine of secularism and the forms of meaning and subjectivity associated with what he calls the epistemic category of the secular. This is a useful distinction because the political doctrine of secularism, which includes the categories of public engagement supported by the state, like citizenship, does shape artistic careers and even the meaning of works of art. But the epistemic category of the secular, what he calls a rich set of concepts, practices, and sensibilities, is ultimately the domain in which art is forged. Further, in certain key accounts, his art historical accounts, art has been seen as a site of secularization, for the category of art is one place where value is placed on human creativity over everything else. As Hans Belting, who's the sort of major person who argues this, has argued, the origin of the modern definition of the work of art, which he places in Europe at the Renaissance, lies in its expression of both an individual artistic subjectivity and a newly transcendent idea of art. The story of this humanist, artist-centered definition of art has always been tricky to tell, however, and not only because of the many continuities of artistic practice across a historical divide. More confusingly, the sacred has continued to be the most important way that people talk about the power of art. As a result, the modern artist is routinely described as a magician or as a modern saint. The museum is designed to be the temple of a civic religion. And the art critic is given the power to, quote, consecrate art objects. Although these phrases mean to displace religious authority, they actually mark a continued relationship of art to religion and the aesthetic experience to enchantment. Talal Asad accounts for this conceptual contamination by thinking through the category of inspiration, the meaning of which changed, he writes, quote, from an authorized reorientation of life towards a telos into a psychology of artistry whose source is obscure and therefore becomes the object of speculation or belief or knowledge. And here I'll ask you to just reflect to 5 minutes ago when Sonal was reading the words of F.N. Souza, who clearly has an interest in articulating in this form of inspiration. Here, Asad evinces a different sense of the relationship between the secular and the religious, as does Belting, for whom the idea of art is genuinely a new thing. Asad pays attention to the emergence of the category of the spiritual as the name for that quality of art, whether religious or secular, that moves people, and is therefore a site of artistic value. Writing of Vasily Kandinsky, a crucial theorist of spirituality in modern art, Peter van de Veer, the anthropologist of Indian religion, goes so far as to argue that, quote, one could legitimately argue that the spirituality of Western modernity is enshrined in its art, unquote. Likewise, the category of genius also emerged in the 19th century to describe how inspiration might be so unevenly distributed among human beings. I mean, it is very sad, right, that we all can't be geniuses. I wake up every year on the MacArthur Day sad about that. Most critiques of genius displace its sacral quality by revealing its ideological function. In his last 2 sets of lectures, however, Michel Foucault inverts that question and explicitly opposes his own early Death of the Author work to look at the possibilities secreted within the social power that we grant to the artist. For Foucault, whose theory of modernity never explicitly attacks the secularization thesis, the artist is a kind of secular hero who replaces the early Christian ascetic in making claims to truth that are independent of pastoral power. As an exemplar of the so-called aesthetics of experience, the artist doesn't verify the truth of art through claims of expertise, but rather through his style of life. Foucault was attracted to the possibilities that art held for a truth that would be independent of authority, whether political or religious. A genealogy of secularism suggests that, against common assumptions, the emergence of the epistemic category of the secular was less a matter of invention of new forms of meaning in the absence of religious transcendence than a series of realignments of the relationship between the transcendent and the human. While art continued to deal in power that transcended common human experience, it was nevertheless also autonomous from religious authority. Art evolved its own set of rules, as Pierre Bourdieu has suggested, for determining its own value. The most important of those in the modern period has been the increasing focus on form or style as the site of artistic innovation. But another crucial site for negotiation has been the relationship of art to its non-secular, pre-modern history. That project was the one that was particularly important for Indian artists, for whom demonstrating the relationship of their work to Indianness was a crucial task. In the post-colonial context, Indian artists and art historians worked together to reconceptualize what came to be known as the Indian artistic tradition in a manner consonant with the globally circulating secular idea of art and artistic subjectivity. The task accorded to the generation of artists that included the Progressive Artist Group was to create new modernist forms of art that would continue the Indian artistic tradition while reimagining it. The standard by which artists were judged was the creation of a new style that was at once individual and national. That was taken as evidence of the achievement of artistic maturity and viewed as a contribution to the modernization of the nation. In this way, style is seen less as a mode of representation and more as an attribute of the artist as a particular sort of person, a mature citizen subject. Take the approach of M.F. Husain. In his autobiography, he claims that he first became acquainted with Indian art history at the 1948 National Exhibition of Art in New Delhi. Pinpointing his visit to the exhibition as a formative moment in the development of his style, Husain reports that he adopted his sense of feminine posture from Gupta bronzes that were so closely associated with the Hindu core of sculptural canon. But in addition to these classical references, he adopted the palette of miniature painting from the Vasily kingdom and what he calls the spirit of folk art, which may actually have been the most dominant element of his work in the 1950s. Indeed, in works like Yatra from 1955, which is on display upstairs, Husain knowingly and playfully negotiates his relationship to a religiously coded art historical past. In this painting, a woman and her child travel across an ochre landscape on a bullock cart, accompanied by a male figure. He is Hanuman, at least from the shoulders up, shown in a key scene from the Ramayana, carrying a whole mountain of healing herbs back to save Ram's brother Lakshmana. In the background, a group of villagers is shown in a frieze-like form, doing everyday tasks. This painting is a good example of how Husain drew from a variety of pictorial narrative traditions to frame his practice as a modern continuation of a national tradition of art. As Geeta Kapoor notes, Husain's value as a, quote, national artist was based in his ability to maintain artistic autonomy while also representing the nation. That contradiction in terms was sustained, she writes, quote, by an idealized notion of the artist's access to internal and cultural plenitude. And again, I'll refer to Sonal's quoting of M.F. Husain, where he says basically that is the grounds of his expression. The terms that critics use to describe Husain's approach envision the painter as an embodiment of the connection between the past and the present, artistic tradition and modernism, and the individual and the nation. These descriptions focus on Husain's qualities or outlook rather than his actions or choices. They envision the artist as a kind of passive medium rather than an actor. The truth of his expression lies in its spontaneous transmission of inspiration found in the richness of India's aesthetic past rather than in the decisions made as an artist. This notion of truth and its relationship to inspiration is at the heart of the modern theory of genius, right? Which, as I've noted, is a secular form of subjectivity in its focus on the psychology of artistry and its assumption that the artistic self is the precondition for inspiration, not its product. But the association of the modernist visual art, with the political ideology of secularism and the role given to secularism in the Nehruvian vision of national development prompted a concurrent understanding of artistic subjectivity in which agency is quite central. In many accounts, the source of Husain's inspiration remains obscure, but in Husain's own narrative, privileged by some of his biographers but not all, he emphasizes his active role in finding inspiration and developing his means of expression, a modernist visual language that was consonant with the Indian artistic tradition. The artist has, in fact, explained his process in detail. He begins with an, that stupid button. Okay, there we go. He begins with an artistic tradition, periodized and therefore understood through its attachment to religious traditions, both high and low. For instance, the Khajuraho complex, which Husain visited in 1954, is frequently used to show the place of eroticism in Hindu art. Husain traveled to the site to educate his eye, and he made around 200 sketches of its sculptural details. As he recalls, and this is Husain, the sketches, quote, were not copies. While transfiguring them onto paper, I simplified the form to get the minimum structure. The aim was to understand and evolve, not imitate, out quote. In drawings that privileged that structure over either verisimilitude or ornament, Husain identified formal strategies that he considered to be essentially Indian. And yet, the way that he deployed those formal strategies came to be recognized as his own modern individual style. Husain's idea of influence involved stripping away the historical and social context of a work of art in order to discover its core set of formal properties. That included any immediate sacred or devotional context of the work, since the idea was to find cultural properties that transcended narrow religious practice. The sketch aims at the significance of form, and its form signifies expression twice over. First, the sketch offers a means for the expression of Indianness or for the transmission of cultural content. And second, the sketch is, of course, itself an index or a material trace of the artist's own expression, or to push this further, of himself. The sketch signifies, even more than a finished painting, the development of Husain's individual style and the expansion of his oeuvre. Representing a chunk of space-time out of the artist's life, it's a step in the gradual unfolding of his genius and evidence of his connection to cultural plenitude. It is therefore both a trace of his agency, his active mediation of the relationship that others have to their own artistic tradition, and his passivity, the manner in which he is a medium for the national past. Secularism in the Nehruvian period emphasized the active transformation of the multifarious Indian tradition into new shared modes of belonging that could transcend the religious and other ascriptive identities that had been the cause of internal conflict. As Sri Rupa Roy, Satish Deshpande, and Sunil Khilnani have described in various ways, the Nehruvian state strongly advocated the development of new secular idioms of belonging, idioms that were exhibited by exemplary national subjects. As Deshpande argues, although it was of course abstracted from subnational content, the modernist idiom of citizenship was also meant to collapse all mediating forms of identity, whether caste, religion, region, etc., that came between the citizen and his or her own nation state. Even if the Nehruvian elite was drawn from a very narrow stratum of regional class and caste backgrounds, the modernist idiom of secular nationalist citizenship it deployed allowed it to render invisible its own ascriptive markers and think of itself in purely national terms. As a lower middle class Muslim from the Shi'i Sulaimani sect, raised in the princely states of Indore and Baroda, and educated outside of government institutions, Husain fell outside the elite stratum on all counts. That matters because, as critics of the Nehruvian state have maintained, the modernist idiom of citizenship was far outweighed in practice by a mode of citizenship in which religious identity was paramount in a post-colonial translation of the colonial ethnographic state. Against what historians Gyan Pandey and Shahid Amin have described as systematic exclusions of Muslims from unmarked categories of citizenship, Husain's claim to a purely national identity rested upon his ability to show the affinities between the secular nationalist modernist idiom of citizenship and a modernist idiom of art, in which the individual and the national could coincide. That affinity came on the level of form. What was common were the forms of abstraction involved in the transformation of the Indian artistic tradition and the development of secular modes of belonging. Husain's own artistic identity therefore became a case in point. The identity he chose, artist, transcends other, more ascriptive modes of understanding the self in exactly the same way that his individual style transcends the historical meanings of its influences. Husain continued to present himself in secular nationalist terms up until he passed away in 2011. When asked in 2007 to describe himself, Husain said, and I quote, "I'm an Indian and a painter, that is all." It's hard to see Husain as simply conforming to any rule. Certainly, he preferred to be seen as exceptional at all times. But what I hope is clear is how tightly the artist drew together a demonstration of secularity in forms of expression, a formal process for the secularization of Indian artistic tradition, and a projection of the spaces of art, from the National Museum to Khajuraho, as open, public, and free for the reinterpretation by artists. That was indeed the rule for art in early post-colonial period. Much of the attention, oops, you were supposed to see this earlier, but it'll come. Oh my goodness. All right. Much of the attention given to the progressive artist group, both in the historical moment and more recently by collectors and institutions, can be attributed to their success in responding to these rules. We can see aspects of that response in the paintings I chose to show alongside my words, each of which hangs upstairs in the exhibition. And it is in that respect that I think the group as a whole, as well as its individual members, remain crucial for art historical study. Thanks very much.
First of all, I'd really like to thank Columbia for collaborating with us on this conference. And of course, Sonal and Karin, who gave excellent presentations and also helped set the stage, both in terms of the discussion of the modern and then the secular for what I hope is going to come next, unless I collapse or you can't hear me. Okay, so a couple of things. I always start with the negative. So here's my negative, and let's get it out of the way. What this little presentation is not. So this little presentation is not really about the show, because I think people have heard enough about it. And they can also go and look up the curatorial lecture online at Asia Society if they want to. So what I'm actually going to do with this is very much pick up on the discussion both of the modern and particularly the secular that Sonal and Karin have set up, and do it at a slight angle, looking and concentrating specifically on two artists from the progressive artist group, and one is Husain for obvious reasons, and the other one is Raza. And you might notice that they are both technically Muslim artists, and they belong to this sort of foundational group. And I've chosen them quite specifically because of the way they come into the dialogue about the construction of the secular. Some of the things that I kind of want to pick up on over here is that, and perhaps in the discussion afterwards with Karin, I have also a few questions of the particular reading of the secular as when it's absorbed into modern art per se, and whether or not that absorption is different in an Indian context. And this is something we can come back to. But from my perspective and from where this particular paper is going, I think there is a slight difference in that the modern Indian artist is something a little bit different with the idea of secularity to an artist per se. And that I think, sets the stage for some of the problems that we see in the concept of the secular as it emerges in the most sort of confrontational way with the issue of Husain and with the rise of the Hindu right. So yes, as you might have guessed, this is a slightly contentious take. It's a little bit rude in parts, and I hope you'll bear with me. So, body politics. Lots of stuff about the body in the nation here. On the midnight hour of August 15, 1947, India was born. But this, of course, as we all know, was a very bloody birth, thanks to the partition of the subcontinent, which happened simultaneously. The Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, asked for a nation of South Asian Muslims. Pakistan was to be their new homeland. Of course, not all of India's Muslims wanted to leave, and some believed that their Muslim identity was secondary to their Indian one. But many did, and out of this rupture came two nations with two competing national dialogues: a Muslim Pakistan and a secular India. Among the biggest proponents of this secularity, its symbolic capital, as it were two Muslim artists, S.H. Raza and M.F. Husain, both founding members of the Progressive Artists Group. This paper deconstructs their story. So you have Husain, and this really iconic work called The Spider and the Lamp becomes a stamp, and the same privilege is given to Raza, also a stamp. So, as I was saying, this talk is not really about the exhibition as such, but at some of the ideas that motivated my PhD and hence in some way led to the show as a visual conceptualization of some of the problems with the intersection of the modern, the secular, and ideas of national identity, which I was really grappling with. So the intersection of Indian art and nationalism in particular. And over here, one of the key motifs that I'm going to pick up on is the entanglement of the secular with the idea of Mother India. But first, what is secularism? In India, secularism is slightly divergent from the norm, is what I will argue. And how is it embodied in the work of the PAG, or the Progressive Artists Group? With the rise of the ultra-right, which we see today, can secularism of India's artists save the day? And what would that even mean? We will examine the notion of an Indian secularism and its intersection with the modern and ideas of progress. This is why the Bombay's Progressive Artists Group, formed in the immediate aftermath of Indian independence in 1947, with the agenda of giving birth to a new art for a new secular nation, is a natural place to start. So in the catalogue, which I am in no way pushing, we have three people. Faisal Devji refers to the work of the Progressive Artists Group as borrowing from a vernacular secularism. Also, Amala Lana's essay argues for the word syncretic in the case of the PAG. And Gayatri Sinha, who has written the other essay, dubs this group plural secularists. Yet secularism is a particularly fraught in the case of one of its founder members, as we know, Husain, whose encounter with the Hindu right ended up leading to his exile, to his dying a citizen of Qatar, rather than India, in 2011, and to 300 court cases launched against him at various times, by his own count. The problem started in the 1980s and culminated in 2005. Why? Because he was a Muslim artist who painted Mother India, a Hindu goddess, in the nude. If anyone threw up the fault lines then in Indian secularism, it was undoubtedly Husain. So if the harassment started with a sketch of Saraswati, goddess of wisdom and learning, and I do want you to pay attention to this particular image because I will come back to the importance of the goddess Saraswati towards the end of the talk and make my slightly contentious point. And of course, the harassment then culminated with this untitled work, which was labeled by an auction house, Bharat Mata, i.e. Mother India. So Husain always claimed that that was not the title he gave to it, but I mean, as we'll see by the end of this lecture, whether or not he actually gave it, this is what it is. So, however, before going on to unpack the secular Husain's mother troubles, as I call them, I want to flag up that this paper is going to make a slightly unconventional argument about the secular. I don't think that even in its updated version, it offers a clear-cut salvation. So I will take the stand on the basis of, you guessed it, Mother India herself. Both Raza and Husain, the two members that will concern us most here today, at least for my talk, use her in different forms, and both have been hailed at different times in their career as exemplary secular artists. In Husain's case, we know that, slightly embarrassingly, in the 1970s, in the years of the emergency of Indira Gandhi, he was the official artist, arguably of the secular, having painted Indira, who contentiously writes the word secularism into the Indian constitution, and contentiously because it's put into the preamble to the constitution. Oh, why is it sticking? Okay, it doesn't like the emergency either. So, okay, here we have Indira Gandhi and Husain, and again, please look at these images. And you have a map, and Indira Gandhi very much as Mother India. Also, strangely, mostly nude in the middle one. I don't know what happened to the image that was meant to follow this. Very weird. Okay. Yes. So what precipitates Husain's fall from grace, from secular patriot for the Congress Party to secular traitor for Hindutva, the Hindu right? Is it the inadequacy of his concept of secularism, or is it secularism itself that is a flawed concept? But what is Indian secularism? And why is it sometimes called secular? Well, basically, there's a current debate, an ongoing, long-standing one, where both the Hindu right and the sort of intellectual left use the word secularism. And they each call themselves secular. So the other side is criticized for being secular. However, in 2001, Geeta Kapoor's When Was Modernism is published, and she says, taking a cue from the various examples of Indian art in the 20th century, we can claim a tradition of the modern that inscribes within its very narrative the aspirations of the secular nation. Kapoor's oeuvre encompasses three waves of artists. Obviously, the progressive artist group. The second is a 1980s Baroda School of Art. And the third is installation art post-globalization. The first, of course, is what concerns us here. So the usual definition of secularism, and not when talking about art, but just secularism per se in the Western narrative, is usually a complete separation of state and church, i.e. a separation of religion from politics. My talk argues that in an Indian context, this separation never really takes place. And since it doesn't, we will investigate what idea of the secular modern Indian art, particularly with these artists, work with. I will argue that the PhD artists create a utopic ideal of the secular that is often a blending together of India's different religious strands, much like Karin talked about with Husain. A Hindu-Muslim-Buddhist-Jain merger, that was a mouthful, that takes place through the formal properties of art. The most consistent strand of this that we will see emerging is Bhakti Sufism. So Bhakti is a medieval devotional tradition with saints, such as Mirabai, a Rajput princess, which draws from Hindu folk beliefs and speaks about a personal relationship to God. Sufism is a strain of Islam that is likewise about developing a personal relationship with God, often through music and poetry. So they're both devotional strands, and coming together, they form this very powerful sort of myth for the liberal left. And you see this evidenced in the artists, Bhakti, Sufi, Secularism. In the subcontinent, these two strands were thought to meet and merge, particularly in Kashmir, with its plethora of Sufi shrines, which were also used by Hindus, in particular in the Mughal era. So a truly hybrid, inclusive belief system supposedly emerged. And this is a romantic view. I'm not saying it's not, but it's the kind of lineage that we actually see constructed with these artists. A Hindu-Muslim merger that was spearheaded, arguably in this narrative, by a Mughal emperor, Akbar. And it culminated in Dara Shikoh, the Mughal emperor who never was. And I'm going to go through this bit very quickly just so that you can see a few images. So Akbar in Fatehpur Sikri, his capital, which was built to honor the Sufi saint Salim Chishti. And then this legacy is carried on by the rulers who follow him, who are also Sufi, Jahangir and Shah Jahan. And Jahangir has a successor, an heir who he wants, and that is his oldest prince, Dara Shikoh, who is considered the most liberal, the most syncretic, and it's Dara Shikoh who's responsible for the translations of the Ramayana, of Hindu epics into Persian, and of course this never happens, right? So Shah Jahan wants the good Mughal, Dara Shikoh, but what we get instead is the bad Mughal, Aurangzeb, his brother who kills him, captures him, and is of course an Orthodox Sunni. So this is where the kind of dialogue really diverges in terms of Indian nationalism versus Pakistani nationalism, because for Pakistan, Aurangzeb is, the Sunni hero of the nation state, whereas of course for India, he is always the bad guy, and the problems start with him. So what does this have to do with Mother India and the progressives? In 1947, F.N. Souza founded the Progressive Artist Group alongside Raza, Husain, Ara, Gade and Bakre. They were later joined by others such as Krishan Khanna, V.S. Gaitonde, Banu Attaya, the only woman, by the way, and closely associated with Akbar Padamsi, Taib Mehta, and Ram Kumar, the heroes upstairs, in other words. The group was composed of artists from widely differing social, religious, and caste backgrounds. Raza was a Muslim from Madhya Pradesh. His father worked as a forest ranger. Ara was born in semi-rural Andhra Pradesh in 1914, the son of a bus driver and a Dalit. And Husain was born in 1915, a Muslim, and he started his career as a painter of billboards in cinema hoardings, and he also, we've now discovered, painted furniture and designed furniture. Souza came from an impoverished Roman Catholic family. He was also from Goa, which never really belonged to India until 1961, I think. So the point is that this was a very diverse, very sort of secular, plural, multi-religious India that kind of is embodied in this group of artists. And much like India's first Prime Minister Nehru's Republic Day parades, they themselves symbolized this and drew upon this kind of secularity, unity and diversity, as it were, within their iconography. And this is the three waves. And Republic Day Parade, Ara's work that references it. Birth by Souza. And Krishan Khanna's News of Gandhiji's Death. Why have I stopped here? Because while, of course, you have two narratives happening, with a secular India on the one hand, a Muslim Pakistan on the other. Not everybody within India, as we know, agreed with this particular idea of a plural, multi-religious definition of the nation. And who are the people who didn't? Well, they were also the ones who assassinated Gandhi, the Hindu right. And so this particular image is the death of Gandhiji, and it kind of sets one kind of tone. So with Hindutva, they demanded a Hindu Rashtra, or Hindu nation, and for them, India's Muslim past had to be obliterated. This being the case, it became more important than ever for India's liberals to find symbolic ways of reclaiming the idea of a secular and a multi-religious India. The fact that neither Husain nor Raza, both Muslim artists, left for Pakistan, despite the fact that they had relations who moved, made them perfect candidates for becoming symbols of India's inclusivity, assisted by the iconic hybrid images packed with multi-religious references. Their work became metaphors then for plurality. So just very quickly taking you through this plurality, first again we have the good son. Just a little quote from Christian Khanna. So that's the good son, Raza, and soon we'll be coming to the bad son, Husain. So Raza took a more abstract path of borrowing from India's multi-religious past. So let's just watch the little transition. So these are two works from the show upstairs, talking about the inspirations behind his creation of the Bindu. And as you can see, in the case of Raza, he left for France in the 50s, but by the 70s was very bored with the development of his iconography, and he started to make regular visits to India, to the Ajanta and Ellora caves, to Rajasthan, and he started looking again at Rajasthani miniatures, and a very sort of plural and it's quite specific that he draws on Rajasthani miniatures, not a Mughal past exactly, but a kind of a very syncretic form. And so, hence, this is from upstairs. You can see here this work, and then Rajasthan that he makes. So you can see the colors, but you can also see the development then of the Bindu, which he calls a primal seed. You can also see there's an obvious reference and an influence of the Mughal past, as this painting of Fatehpur Sikri, the Emperor Akbar's capital, shows. So Sikri, yes, and here you have Sikri. Just some of the inspirations. So the mandala, tantra, but also Islamic friezes. And then you have Mother India in a different form. So this is Mother, Mother Earth, Mata Bhumi, all of these things. And so this painting is sort of the first one where you see he starts calling his black dot the Bindu, and that's 1981. And the Bindu is framed within the whole package of a returning home, of a symbolic returning home to India, to the motherland. And the inscription here reads in Hindi, "Mother, when I come home, what will I bring?" Okay, so you have Raza, and as we've said, also using Mother India, right? And then, so this is Mother, and why is she a discriminatory mummy? Well, particular people are incredibly discriminatory, and we'll come to them in a second. And this is, of course, an image from the Mother India film. And who does Mother India discriminate against? Well, perhaps the bad son. But why? For Husain's iconic status within India, especially in the 1950s, was due to his very specific purchase on the idea of the secular. So as Karin has already been through this, I won't go through this with any sort of depth. But the three styles that he talks about borrowing from: Vasily miniatures, Gupta sculpture, and the folk. Right. Also, an aside, Basholi is symbolically kind of important in this dialogue. Why? Because Basholi is a style of Pahari painting from the Punjab hills, and this has a direct connection to Dara Shikoh, the emperor that never was, because he flees from his brother and he goes up into the Punjab hills, and as he does that, he takes, because that's what you do when you're fleeing for your life, miniature artists with you. So he dies, they don't, and the style of Pahari painting kind of develops. So symbolically, it's kind of important that Husain, of the kind of Bhakti Sufi secular past that he's drawing on, should be directly a Dara Shikoh lineage, right? And just a few images of how we get to Husain's most problematic work. And what I'm trying to prove here is that he's constructing these images. And there's a natural progression from the use of these kind of forms to his construction of the Mother India image. And so the point is that, as you see that happening with Yatra, we've got this contrast upstairs, and the kind of things that he was looking at. Also the sort of man, an iconic painting from 1951, and the use of the hand gesture on top. I'm kind of scared to poke this. So you can see the hand over there, and it's quite interesting that it could be the hand that you see in Nehru's new capital for the Punjab, Chandigarh, designed by Le Corbusier. It could be that hand sculptor, or it could even be the Panjat and Panch, which is used in Shia processions of mourning, right? Because Husain was a Shia, and it could be either of those images. So a really syncretic style. So Husain performs a very Bhakti Sufi merger of Indian syncretism, and it's the same motif that Gita Kapoor lauds. So we know that both Husain and Raza mined images of Mother India. As art historian Gayatri Sinha explains, in Hindu Puranic thought, the land is possessed by a divinity, usually a goddess, and is a manifestation that coheres with her body. The description of the goddess in the 12th century accords to her the earth itself as primal identity. And this is how, and this is my argument, it's through this kind of drawing of this particular kind of secular past that he arrives at this image, and this is the image that then gets into trouble, right? Why? So what went wrong? Wasn't Husain's mother meant to be a syncretic secular symbol? Yet Hindutva refuses to see her as a symbol of patriotism when she is deployed by a modern artist, if he is Muslim. So when Husain says in his defense of the Hindutvadis, I am Indian, I am a painter, that is all, we must ask what version of Indianness his use of Mother India suggests. For me, it is not incidental that Husain's Bharat Mata should have fallen foul of the Hindu right. This is because they operate with a different definition of what counts as India, and certainly with what counts as secular. And this is my point. This difference, when fought out over the body of Mother India, becomes especially fraught because she is an inherently ambiguous, if deeply important, symbol claimed by both sides of the political divide. Because, and here's a rub, she is vital to both secular liberals and their opponents' Hindutva. As theorist Kyan Pandey notes, Hindutva's idea of Hindu Rashtra or Hindu nation, which first came to proper fruition in the 1920s. Swami Shraddhanand's Savior of a Dying Race advocated worshipping the mother spirit in three guises. Now let's listen to this. Gau Mata, mother cow. Goddess Saraswati, that's why I wanted you to look at the Husain Saraswati, goddess of learning. And Mother Earth, or Mata Bhumi. In 1905, Aurobindo Ghosh, one of the supposed founders of Hindutva, was asked, how can one become patriotic? Now let's listen to his reply. I quote, do you see this map? It is not a map, but the portrait of Bharat Mata. Its cities, mountains, rivers, and jungles form her physical body. All her children are her nerves, large and small. Concentrate on Bharat as a living mother. Worship her with mindfold, that word again, bhakti. So, it should be noted that this is the overworked terrain that Husain and Raza inevitably stepped into with their depictions of Mother India. But Pandey emphasizes, and this is the problem, Hindutva's version of the Hindu nation is exclusive, not inclusive Hinduism. It sees Hindustan as a nation from time immemorial, feeding off a Vedic Aryan past, and it is not about to accept alternate read Muslim or Christian or Dalit traditions easily. Hindutva's saffron-waving goddess is an overtly discriminatory mummy. Hindutva's envisioning of India as a mother goddess, then, is fraught also with masculine angst. And what do I mean? Oops, I don't know why it was put there. So this is sort of deconstructing Mother India on the, is it an RSS symbol or otherwise? Okay, so this is what I mean. Very macho. Pandey notes that Hindutva's Mother India is a female form. Hindutva's Mother India is a female form that has to be protected from invaders, from foreigners, from Muslims, in other words, by their reading. She's a defenseless damsel calling for the macho male to give her succor. No wonder then that Hindutva uses the warrior god Ram as its symbol, and that tormenting Muslim artists who apparently abuse Mother by painting her in the nude, and abuse her chastity, supposedly, is par for the course. Given this climate, one could say that it seems obvious that while Muslim Raza's geometric, desexualized tantric Sufi images of Mother India, Mata Bhumi, as Mother Earth, Ma, the Divine Mother, one unlikely to give offense to Hindutvadis, and they didn't, Husain's figurative goddess Saraswati, the goddess is a customary Mother India for the right, after all, was a red, or should I say saffron, drag to Hindutva's very macho bull. Being a Muslim put Husain on the wrong foot from the start. The fact that he then painted Mother India in the nude could not really have acted as anything but an act of sacrilege according to their lights. A violation of Hindu sentiments, and for them, nationalist ones in one fell swoop. So to argue that Husain's images follow a modernist tradition of experimentation with form were arguments that fell on deaf ears. Nevertheless, in her defense of Husain, Geeta Kapoor and in some ways, Karin sort of setting up of him as a modern artist following a particular kind of secular trajectory, argues that Husain's iconography might borrow from the various religious traditions of India, but they are one step removed from religious belief, right? As images they worship at the altar of another deity, the temple of modern art. They are not sacred, they are aesthetic symbols. But, and this is my point, I argue that for the progressives, such symbols are steeped in religious language. They are a religious fusion because India's secularism is a spiritually inflected one, and as such, multi-religious syncretic fusions are fragile. There is no running away from this. If Mother India is claimed across the spectrum of the liberal Bhakti Sufi spiritual secularism, as well as Hindu nationalism, can anyone stop anyone else from reading her as they choose to? Mother India, as a symbol of the right kind of secularism, is precariously dependent on interpretation. Thus, Husain's dilemma leaves us on the doorstep of another one. How can liberals ensure that our version of India as inclusive is acknowledged as the right version of Indianness? How can we be sure that Husain's paintings are seen in the appropriate syncretic secular spirit and not Hindutva's prejudiced gaze? We know that today's secular is a fought over concept, with both left and right struggling to define the other as secular. And my point is this: if there is no easy salvation via Indian secularism, its build-up of iconography needs to be unpacked in order to be meaningful, and who does the unpacking is an open question. Perhaps then it is no wonder that contemporary Indian artists are so distrustful of Husain's and the progressives' Mother Dearest. Too bad, mummy. However, distrust is not where my story ends, and it's ending very shortly. So there is no magic mantra called Indian secularism. But why should we expect miracles? Why are artists expected to perform what nobody else in a political arena can do? Perhaps the way forward is for those of us convinced that secularism should be syncretic, inclusive, bhakti secular, all those things, should make ourselves seen and heard. It's important to remember in our turbulent times that at the dawn of the Indian nation state, at least there were those like the PAG who tried to make a difference to the idea of India. And what an idea it was. Thank you.
Thank you for this really stimulating and very wide-ranging presentation to start the day off and our symposium off. I came from basically sociology initially, so this panel particularly was very stimulating for me because, you know, in its statement of attempting to move beyond issues of aesthetic style, but to look at the Indian modern as also a kind of very complex collaborator or partner of reacting to also history and historiographical changes, I think raises a lot of questions, one of which, in a sense, makes us reflect on the present moment, as I think each of your papers sort of end up at a certain point. So I want to ask the question that you all have been discussing, this issue between the sacred and the secular and the role of art, particularly the Indian modern, in another way. That means instead of talking about the secular, I wanted to ask you about the sacred. That is it also a sense in which instead of different senses of the secular, what is the stance of art, of artists, not just the progressives, but other artists following towards the sacred? And is it also a sense that we are in this debate also because what we believe is the sacred has changed quite radically? And I say this from also a comparative perspective, in West Asia, in the Middle East, and in Muslim Southeast Asia, the new debate that artists have been caught in, because they are in a majority Muslim population, it's over what is sacred, what is the role of art in dealing with that sacred. So I want to throw that open as a kind of provocation.
Let Karin go.
Since you wrote the book on the secular.
Right. So I think one thing is that I tried today to, as a kind of exercise to myself, to think about the 50s, the late 40s and the 50s as a particular historical moment. Because you get something that's, and there what is really interesting is the investment in a kind of, in sovereignty, in the sacrality of the nation. Right, and as the citizen, and particularly at one point very early on, I called Husain and others super citizens. They were sort of not exemplars, really. They were emblematic, or they were superheroes of this nation, and they were invested with, the kind of words used to describe this. When he died, I was surprised, and he was 96, 94. I thought he was going to live forever. That is the kind of investment people had in this. And there was a particular reason for that, right? You needed people. And so needed people to have that kind of power. And you needed that power to reside in the human. And so what ends up happening, and I think that later on this becomes problematic, right? It's hard to sustain that for more than a period. What ends up happening is that investment in particular people makes those people vulnerable later on, right? So what's weird is the sacred secular there is the kind of movement of the human as becoming the new form of the sacred in the 40s and 50s.
That's really interesting.
Speak louder.
You can just speak.
Hi. Okay. Don't have to speak to my chest.
No.
Okay, that's good. That's really, really interesting is the idea of the sacred being invested in the human. And I wonder whether, in fact, it's that particular investment that kind of shows the difference within the way in which visual culture operates in India, not just at that period, but ongoingly. Also for politics, right? And the fact that it is figures who invest themselves with the sacred in order for political legitimacy. And politicians follow the same move that Husain makes or was sort of invested with. Sonia Gandhi posing as Mother India, not in the nude. Indira Gandhi actually supporting an artist who presented her like that. And that whole idea that which is totally not original to me, someone like Crespini talks so much about that, about the whole visual culture sort of drawing on the sacred for political legitimacy. And what happens with that when you have a modern art that is doing the same thing and then sharing those images? Like, what does that do with the dialogue between the sacred and the secular? What does that do with the connection of both those things to politics?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So is it also a sense that for that kind of conception, that kind of, and the lecture we had by Faisal Devji, mm-hmm. I mean, he used a very rather controversial phrase, and he referred to the progressives as, in a sense, almost imagining themselves as they were part of a heroic age.
Yes.
I think that's the sense of what you seem to be hinting at, may not exactly, but is it also a kind of thing that kind of vision of the secular that were held by these artists was there a sense that it could be sustained, or was in the 40s and 50s already a sense that it is, going back to history, a historical moment that...
I have to say, I've been struck by a few different things in our conversation and in responding and in thinking about your questions. And one of them is that for all the, and I tried to do this a little bit with the presentation that I gave, but for all the discussion of the progressive artists as iconoclasts, as superheroes, in some ways, I think Karin's presentation and her emphasis on rules, my presentation and the emphasis on effects, suggest that what we're seeing actually is a larger discourse on modern art and citizenship that may be particular to post-colonial India rather than to just an exceptional group of artists. But that the claiming of exceptionality, whether it's by the artists themselves or by the state, is also a part of the discourse and the myth-making around them. I think that the other point that's come across quite clearly in some of these presentations, but also existing scholarship by Kapoor, by Guatakrita, Karin's work, Crespini's work, is that the art world and the public sphere operated along different lines with different codes of what constituted secularity. I mean, in some ways, I might actually joke with you that secular sacrilege was a sacred value of the art world, whether it was Sousa's cherished ideal or Manto, or to some extent one could see some of these effects among contemporary artists today. But to return to your earlier point, I think that the times have changed. I think I was trying to certainly to at least flag some of that, to say we are not in a Nehruvian world anymore. And at the same time, I resist kind of declaring all of those effects of modernist art dead, not for nostalgic reasons, because I actually think these effects are alive in many ways, in civil society, in certainly the art world. But I do think that the attachment, for example, to freedom or expression as a value in a contemporary art world that is deeply invested in conceptual art now. I mean, this is a very interesting kind of attachment that sort of, I think, still remains. But to go back to your point about, was it a heroic age? I don't know. It was an age with a different set of social and political values and systems, I think, than the one
and I think
that we're in now.
We have to go to audience very soon, but just to mark that point that Zehra mentioned about the distinctiveness of this, I think that is quite clear because there are certain historical social formations that were in play that were very specific to colonial India, but I would only make the point that if we look comparatively, we realize that across the continent that we call Asia, especially those areas which emerge from colonialism, I think the fact that modern art, when it emerged, for example, my field is in Indonesia, when it first emerged, it of course similarly became the battleground for these ideological kind of debates, and there again a sense of polarization happened, and in Indonesia there's a certain inflection because within the arts itself there was a split between the representational, social, political, and the sort of abstract formalists. But they were both, in a sense, there was even a struggle about what was secular within the sort of artistic sphere. But I think that's what's very interesting about the modern, especially when you come across, because there are differences, but there are also certain sort of webs that seem to echo against each other. And just to end with the contemporary, I think, for example, the work of Naeem Mohammedin, this video precisely is about that moment of also, we want to say, late modernism. There are these effects, these webs that while they are very specific in specific location, they sort of imbricate each other. And it's sometimes very complex to sort of disentangle that. So I just we have a few minutes for audience questions. So I want to throw it open to the audience for questions. Would you please raise your hand and we'll give you a mic. Please identify yourself because the session is being webcast.
Boon Hui Pepe is asking as well.
Sorry, somebody has helped me because I'm absolutely blind up here.
This stage is like you just can't see out.
Yeah. This proper theatre stage, you can't see it.
I'm Pepe Carmel from NYU, and I want to thank all of you for terrific presentations. It's been a very exciting morning. I have a question so simple it probably ranks as stupid. Responding to Sonal Kulkarni's presentation, you mentioned neo-concretism and Gutai as other important movements of the post-war era that were long neglected and are now receiving the attention they deserve. Let me note that they are both abstract in very different ways. So my question is, why did the progressives choose to remain figurative artists in the 1940s and 50s?
They didn't all. They didn't all, right? I mean, they didn't all choose to remain figurative. It's also quite interesting that that's the particular trajectory that, is sort of, if you talk about Husain, you think in figurative terms, but Raza wasn't figurative, and in some ways, because within their ranks they were so diverse, there are elements that at different stages of their career they're more or less figurative. So that distinction between figurative and abstract doesn't really hold in the same way. And if you were to go upstairs and particularly the second last room, you can see a conversation between even the most figurative of Husain's horses, and yet there's a conversation between that and the Raza Bindu, and there's similar motives. So maybe breaking down that distinction is also where it's at.
I wanted to just say in response to that question that it's actually a wonderfully rich and complex question. I answered it one way in the book that I published a few years ago, and just this month, as Vishaka reminded me, an article that's appeared in Archives of Asian Art, why this attention to the concretists and Gutai, and there are ways in which these movements were certainly well known in the West, previously can be related to various kinds of avant-garde practices and movements, whether they're in Paris or New York, even though they, of course, emerged separately. I will also echo what Zehra is saying, that the artists of the Progressive Artist Group, but the Indian tradition by and large, and I've been asked this often, is a tradition that is rich in abstraction, although one of the most prominent art critics in India, Geeta Kapoor, who has been very significant in disseminating critical discourses on modern Indian art, has been a champion of figurative and narrative painting, especially coming out of Baroda in Bombay in the 60s and 70s, signaled by the Place of People group. But as I often joke with colleagues, well, Kapoor saying that Indian art or the tradition of modern Indian art is figurative is a little bit like Greenberg saying that the tradition of American art is optical. It's a polemic. It's certainly not I mean, she would say it herself. It's not a historical argument, but it's a position that she took as a critic at a certain point in championing a school of art. But there's lots of attention now. I think the Mohammadi show was a good example of it. But lots more on artists who work in the Jairam Patel show at the Karin Museum. Wonderful abstract artists. So there's many of them.
There's a hand somewhere there, which Kelly will have to point out. Yeah.
My name is Siba Das. I'm an ex-UN official, and I love art, and I write about it from time to time. Okay, and I just wanted to say, two things very quickly. One is a comment on this question which my friend from the audience has just asked about the question of figuration versus abstraction and so on. I just wanted to say that Helen Molesworth, recently, or about 3-4 years ago, writing about Amy Silman, argued that there really is no difference between abstraction and figuration. They are both one and the same. And if figuration is a form of narration or narrative art, or then similarly abstraction can also be a form of narrative art. And in fact, there are artists today who say that they are abstract artists, but they're also narratively abstract artists. So I think, so that's again, but let me come back to the issues that were being discussed today. And I just wanted to say that I don't know what the answers are, and perhaps our colleagues here may have some pointers to a possible answer or possible answers. What I wanted to say is that what's happening in India today in terms of the rise to power of the Hindu right is in a way part of a larger global movement, which is taking place even now. I mean, take the United States. I mean, the emergence of politicians who are insisting that the United States is a Judeo-Christian country, period. Okay. In fact, right now, the Trump administration in the United Nations is trying to put back the clock in terms of whatever the UN has achieved in terms of taking further the discourse on gender issues. For example,
you have a question, sir?
Yeah.
We're running a bit short of time.
I'll just come to the question. And there's also, let's say, Viktor Orban, who is openly saying that he's recreating a Christian nation in Hungary. You have similar moves taking place in Poland, et cetera, et cetera. So it seems to me that this trend towards greater religiosity is a larger global trend. So how do we relate the discussion this morning to those issues? That's my question.
I can take this. So when I wrote The Art of Secularism, it was implicitly comparative, because as you can tell from my voice, I'm American. And I grew up in the Midwest next to evangelical Christians, and who have exactly the same kind of commitment to a personal relationship to God that you see within the Bhakti Sufi tradition. Meaning that's always the comparison that is there, right, to radical forms of Christianity developed in the United States and other forms of personal relationships to God. And so what I think is crucial within the thing to grab from this kind of scholarship on secularity and the relationship to art is actually something I didn't have time in this presentation to raise, which is the idea of artists as secular critics of secularism. That actually what you have is you have people who evince secular commitments in their way of being in the world, but are themselves some of the most articulate critics of the limits of secularism as a political ideology. And so the use that you can have today in a time of fomenting religiosity or what have you, or politicization of religious categories, is that you can find within art both in the United States and in India, the tools with which to make an articulate critique of the limits of secularism as a political language, right? Because, of course, when you have that critique, then you can form different political possibilities within it.
Okay, one final question. Let's go.
I have a mic, so I think I'm going to go ahead. This is Brinda Kumar, and you're going to be hearing from me a little bit later on in the afternoon. And I think this is a great segue, your remarks, Karin, because what struck me was that when we talk about secularism and the progressive artists, we keep coming back to Husain, principally, and then Raza. And I was wondering, can one read different forms of a secular response in any of the other artists in a way that perhaps gestures towards these critiques of secularism that may have well been understood in that moment as well? If it's a broad question, so if we don't have time to go into it now, we can chat about it over lunch, but if you can take a stab at it, I'd appreciate it.
Just one quick response from each of our panelists.
Well, the only bad thing is that I fell asleep a little bit, and I didn't catch the end bit of the question.
Other forms of secularism with the other artists.
From other artists.
Yeah.
Not Husain.
Well, Sousa, right? Sousa was my example. Yes, Sousa is the best example. Sorry, I stole him. I was waiting. I gave other people minutes to grab onto it. So Sousa, of course, is an anti-clerical critique of secularism. So he's within the language, the long language of anti-religious authority, and also the nomination of himself, the enfant terrible, as an alternative to religious authority, right, from a Catholic imagination.
But I think, Brinda, your question is a little bit about whether one has to inhabit a minority position in order to be able to articulate this kind of critique. Right, and many of the artists that I mentioned, and my talk was expansive to include many, many other artists, whether it's Uday Shankar or Prithviraj Kapoor or Mulkraj Anand, suggest that yes, of course, you can have that kind of critique from a member of the majority population, but who self-identifies as a part of the secular elite or the secular critics of secularism, as Karin has described them.
So you would have Anand's Untouchable as being an exemplary work of a secular critique of secular capitalism.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder in some ways whether the question is also about how we define secularism in the first place, and whether the critique of secularism in that could be envisioned is a particular idea of the secular as being uber-rational, as being about the state, as being detached from individual spirituality. And in that sense, then perhaps most of the modern artists that you're talking about are critiquing that kind of bloodless secularism. In coming up with a new form of a secular that has all those other fusions and is more whole. But if that is the case, which is what I would argue that they're doing, and you can see that with the Christian Khanna as much as with an Akbar Padamsi. And so this language, which then is shared across the modern, of this new rebranded secularism, is of course part of the problem, because what happens when someone else comes up with a more instrumentalist way in which they're using that terminology? And perhaps what you have is Husain dying in exile, to come back to that.
Yeah. So I think we have to end here on that sort of
very positive note.
Note, and I would only make one comment that I think in the social sciences there's also this idea that whether it's secularism or the sacred or any freedom, any sort of ideal that has political connotations, I think one of the expressions or one of the indicators in which we can sort of sense that the world is closing, that concept is starting to sort of enclose and be restrictive with all these kind of negative connotations, is when the sort of internal debates within the proponents of that concept start to be silenced, So when it starts to stop critiquing itself, usually that is a kind of, almost like a kind of beginning road to what we now sometimes call fundamentalism or a certain kind of stance, But we'll leave it at that because I think the afternoon sessions will start to unpick very specific manifestations and expressions of a lot of the concepts that started with this sort of opening panel. And as mentioned, we start to go into other areas of artistic expression beyond the visual arts to look at, in a sense, the progressive effect across, other areas of Indian culture in that period. So we break for lunch and we reconvene here at 1:45 for the next sort of panel. But can we please have a round of applause for our wonderful panel?